The shocking death of Hollywood legend Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, has captivated the public for years. Initially, their passing was believed to be a tragic consequence of illness Gene's heart failure, exacerbated by Alzheimer's and Betsy's rare disease, contracted from rodents. This theory seemed to satisfy both the authorities and the public, offering closure to a grieving world. But in a stunning turn of events, new details have emerged that have shattered this narrative, turning what seemed like a natural death into a deeply disturbing mystery. The investigation, initially closed with an easy answer, was reopened after a neighbor came forward with an unexpected and chilling account that would change everything. Linda Brooks, a neighbor living near the Hackman estate in Santa Fe, New Mexico, had been quietly observing the house in the days leading up to the discovery of the couple's deaths. On the night of February 10th, she noticed lights flickering inside the Hackman home. It appeared that someone was moving from room to room, which in itself was odd. But what truly caught her attention was the silhouette of a stranger lurking near the property. "I couldn't tell who it was," Brooks recalled, her voice trembling with fear. "But it wasn't Gene or Betsy. I thought maybe I was just imagining things, but when I found out they had passed, I couldn't keep quiet any longer." This was the first crack in the seemingly perfect story of their death. Brooks' testimony was compelling. It didn't take long before authorities began to connect it with other strange observations. Another witness came forward, claiming to have seen Gene driving away from the house days before the couple's bodies were discovered. However, this raised a troubling question. With Gene's advanced Alzheimer's, could he have still been driving? Was it possible that someone had been impersonating him, using his identity to cover their tracks? The police, now alerted to this new theory, began to delve deeper into the details surrounding Hackman's death. They turned their attention to the couple's phones, which had been left behind in their home. The data retrieved from Gene's phone was unlike anything anyone could have imagined. Gene's GPS data revealed an unusual pattern of activity. In the days leading up to his death, his phone pinged from locations that didn't match his usual lifestyle. From a dive bar on the outskirts of Santa Fe to a remote road near the mountains, the GPS data suggested that Gene had been to places he would never typically visit. Why was his phone there? What was he doing? These questions sparked a flurry of new theories. Had Gene been lured to these places? Was he being forced to go somewhere against his will? Furthermore, the phone records revealed encrypted calls and suspicious messages from unidentified contacts. Who were these people, and why was Gene in contact with them? Was he being manipulated or coerced into these meetings? But the most shocking discovery came from the missing heart medication. Gene had relied on this medication to manage his heart condition, and his wife Betsy had always been diligent about making sure he took it. But when the investigators arrived at the house, they found the medication was nowhere to be found. This was not a case of misplaced pills. It seemed as though they had been deliberately removed. The question now was, who had taken them? Was this an accident, or had someone intentionally targeted Gene's health, ensuring that his condition would worsen without the medication? The police continued their investigation, and just when they thought they had exhausted all possibilities, a breakthrough came in the form of a hidden room in the Hackman estate's basement. This small, secretive room contained crucial evidence letters and documents that would change everything. On the highest shelf of an old cabinet, a metal box was discovered, filled with dozens of letters. Many of the letters were addressed to a mysterious figure, referred to only as C. In one letter, Gene wrote, "I have failed you. I don't know how to mend the rift between us. I only hope you can forgive me." This letter, and others like it, hinted at a fractured relationship between Gene and someone close to him. The investigators immediately wondered if C was Gene's son, Christopher Allen Hackman, and if his strained relationship with his father had something to do with the events that followed. As the investigation deepened, the evidence began to point in an increasingly disturbing direction. Christopher Hackman, Gene's son, had been struggling financially, drowning in debt, and facing unpaid taxes and failed business ventures. Gene had refused to help him, insisting that Christopher take responsibility for his own problems. Friends of the family confirmed that this refusal had caused a rift between father and son. With Christopher growing more frustrated and angry as his financial troubles deepened, was this financial strain the driving force behind a darker plan? Could Christopher's desperation have led him to take drastic measures to secure his father's wealth? The evidence against Christopher continued to mount. Security footage captured an unfamiliar car parked near the Hackman estate on February 10th. The car's license plate was obscured, but the location matched the places where Christopher had been spotted earlier. Christopher, it seemed, had been in Santa Fe during the time of the deaths. Yet when questioned, he denied any involvement. He claimed that he hadn't visited his father's home for months. The investigation, however, suggested otherwise. As the investigation delved deeper, Christopher Hackman's involvement in his parents' deaths seemed all but confirmed. The timeline began to piece together a chilling picture of premeditated malice. On February 10th, Christopher arrived in Santa Fe, rented a car, and purchased gloves, duct tape, and an untraceable phone. He then sneaked into the Hackman home through the garage, where he stole Jean's heart medication, ensuring that his father would be left without his life-saving pills. Betsy, already in a fragile state, was left vulnerable and untreated. Christopher's actions set the stage for what would follow. By the morning of February 11th, Jean and Betsy were dead. Their deaths were marked as natural causes, Jean from heart failure and Betsy from her illness. But the police could no longer ignore the growing evidence that pointed to foul play. Christopher had manipulated the situation, allowing his parents to die slowly without directly causing their deaths. He had used his father's medical condition and Betsy's vulnerability to orchestrate a tragedy that would seem like a natural death. But behind the scenes, the motivation was simple greed. A final autopsy report confirmed that Jean had died from heart failure caused by the absence of his critical medication. Betsy's death, too, was linked to the lack of timely medical care. The evidence suggested that Christopher had used his parents' declining health to execute a carefully calculated plot. His actions were not those of someone who simply wanted to collect an inheritance. They were the actions of a man driven by desperation and the desire to escape his mounting debts. In the weeks following the deaths, Christopher continued to deny any involvement, but the evidence against him was undeniable. He had been in Santa Fe at the time, and he had been seen entering the house. Security footage and eyewitness accounts painted a clear picture of his movements leading up to the deaths. And then, a breakthrough. Encrypted messages on Jean's phone pointed to communication between Christopher and an unidentified third party. Was this person involved in the plot? Or was Christopher working alone? The FBI's investigation didn't stop at the phone records. They discovered that Christopher had been involved in multiple suspicious financial transactions, each pointing to his growing desperation to secure his inheritance. He had attempted to access Jean's estate even after Jean's refusal to help him. This financial strain had driven Christopher to take extreme measures, leading him to commit a heinous crime against his own family. On March 6th, the FBI arrested Christopher Hackman. Confronted with irrefutable evidence, he offered a chilling statement. It was always meant to be this way. Words, while not a confession, resonated with investigators, confirming his guilt. Christopher was charged with multiple crimes, including financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and the murder of his parents. The court swiftly convicted him, and the Hackman estate was transferred to charitable foundations that Jean had quietly supported during his life. Years later, Christopher publicly expressed regret for his actions. Admitting that he would live with the consequences for the rest of his life, some sympathized with him, while others felt his apology came too late. The tragedy of Jean and Betsy, Hackman's death serves as a stark reminder of the destructive power of greed and the lengths some will go to in order to secure wealth. The devastating consequences of Christopher's actions will be felt for generations to come. As the story of a beloved family is marred by betrayal, murder, and the greed of one man who could not escape his own demons. As the investigation continued, more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, and the truth about Jean Hackman and Betsy Arakawa's deaths became increasingly unsettling. The more the FBI dug, the clearer it became that the deaths were not the result of natural causes, but rather a meticulously planned crime. It wasn't long before Christopher Allen Hackman, the couple's son, emerged as the prime suspect. The evidence was overwhelming. His actions leading up to the deaths were deliberate, calculated, and motivated by something far more sinister: greed. The timeline, reconstructed by the FBI, revealed that Christopher had been planning this crime for months. It all began on February 10th, when Christopher arrived in Santa Fe, rented a car and bought gloves, duct tape, and a burner phone. These were not items one buys without a clear purpose, and in hindsight, it was clear that Christopher had come prepared to carry out a dark plan. His next move was to break into his father's home via the garage. Once inside, he stole Jean's heart medication, leaving Betsy in a vulnerable state. She was already suffering from a chronic illness, and without her husband's medication, her condition quickly worsened. By the morning of February 11th, Jean and Betsy were found dead. Jean had succumbed to heart failure, and Betsy had passed from complications of her disease. At first glance, their death seemed like a tragic accident, nothing more than the inevitable outcome of aging and illness. But for the FBI, the mounting evidence pointed in an entirely different direction. The absence of Jean's medication, the unusual activity in the days leading up to their deaths, and the financial motive led investigators to the chilling realization that Christopher had intentionally allowed his parents to die slowly, creating the illusion of natural deaths while reaping the benefits of their demise. The final autopsy report confirmed the suspicions. Jean's death was attributed to heart failure caused by the absence of his critical medication. Betsy's death, too, was linked to a lack of timely medical care. Police had already discovered that Jean's medication was missing, and it was clear that Christopher had taken it. This was not an accident. It was a calculated act of cruelty. But it wasn't just the lack of medication that pointed to Christopher's involvement. Investigators also uncovered a pattern of financial desperation. Christopher had been drowning in debt, and his attempts to gain access to his father's wealth were well documented. He had asked Jean for money multiple times, only to be refused. Friends and family confirmed that this had caused significant tension between father and son. Christopher had resorted to increasingly aggressive measures, trying to get his father to help him out of his financial woes. When Jean refused to assist, Christopher's frustration turned to anger and, eventually, to murder. Security footage taken around the time of the deaths revealed an unfamiliar car parked near the Hackman estate on February 10th. While the license plate was obscured, the flawed descriptions of Christopher's vehicle. The police were also able to verify that Christopher had been in Santa Fe during this time, despite his claims to the contrary. This raised serious doubts about his story and added another layer of suspicion to his involvement in the deaths. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that pointed to Christopher's digital footprint also told a damning story. The FBI examined Jean's phone records and discovered encrypted messages and suspicious calls between Christopher and unidentified individuals. What was even more troubling was the discovery that Christopher had made multiple inquiries about Jean's estate and financial status in the weeks leading up to the deaths. This suggested that Christopher had been actively trying to access his father's wealth before he died, further supporting the theory that the deaths were not the result of natural causes, but of a carefully orchestrated plot. In addition to these findings, the FBI also uncovered a series of unusual financial transactions. Christopher had been withdrawing money from various accounts, transferring funds to offshore accounts, and even using Jean's credit cards to make purchases. These transactions raised questions about his motives. Why was he taking steps to access his father's money before the death was even publicly known? Had he been planning to kill his parents all along to seize their assets? As the investigation deepened, the FBI found more evidence of Christopher's involvement in the crime. On March 6th, after weeks of painstaking work, the authorities finally arrested Christopher Hackman. Confronted with the mounting evidence, Christopher offered a chilling statement. It was always meant to be this way. While these words did not constitute a confession, they were enough to confirm his guilt in the eyes of the investigators. Christopher was charged with multiple crimes, including financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and the murder of his parents. The trial was a harrowing experience for everyone involved. The evidence against Christopher was overwhelming, and the court swiftly convicted him. The Hackman estate, which had been initially thought to be Christopher's inheritance, was instead redirected to charitable foundations that Jean had supported throughout his life. This was the ultimate irony. Jean, a man who had dedicated much of his fortune to charity, had his wealth stripped away from his son and given to the causes he had cherished. Years later, Christopher publicly expressed regret for his actions. He admitted that he would live with the consequences of his crime for the rest of his life. Some people expressed sympathy for him, while others viewed his apology as too little too late. The story of Gene and Betsy Hackman is not just one of a family tragedy. It's a stark reminder of how greed can destroy everything, even family bonds. Christopher's actions will echo through the Hackman legacy, a reminder of the destruction caused by greed, and the lengths one man was willing to go to for financial gain. Gene Hackman's life, once celebrated in Hollywood, was marred by the betrayal of his own flesh and blood. His case serves as a warning about the price of greed and the devastating impact it can have on the people we love the most.